and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me. And today, my special guest is Dr. Kelsey Johnson. Welcome, Dr. Johnson.
So happy to be here.
I need to clarify one thing real quickly, and that is the reason that the time came up wrong is I was vacationing in the Eastern time zone when I set this stream up. And when I set the stream up, I set it to 3:30. But then when I came back to Central Time, it's at 3:30 Eastern Time instead of 3:30 Central Time. And that's why the show showed that it was starting an hour earlier than it really was. So my apologies for that. Show is at the regular time. But Dr. Johnson, thank you for coming. It is a pleasure to have you here.
I'm excited to see where this conversation goes.
Today, we are here to talk about Dr. Johnson's book. It's called Into the Unknown, The Quest to Understand the Mysteries of the Cosmos. And Dr. Johnson is a professor of astronomy at the University of Virginia. And I became familiar with her when she was on the Atheist and Christian Book Club. And I've got a lot of questions about astronomy myself. And so I bought the book and I read it. My first impression of the book was, this is a bit simplistic. Are we going to get into something a little meatier? And it did not take long before we did. And eventually, another chapter or two later, I was in over my head.
Oh, no, I don't want to hear that.
Well, it's just that some of the concepts were just so new to me that it takes a while to grasp. And I'm trying to read the book very quickly to be ready in time for the show. And it's the kind of book that I really need to savor over a period of 6 to 7 months in order to really understand it.
Oh, my goodness. I do love the idea of savoring a book, though. That is a really poetic way to put it.
There is a link to the Amazon copy of the book, and it is well worth your time. Dr. Johnson, my first question, and I hate to have to ask this, but 40% of the people in this country still believe that the Earth is 10,000 years old or less. And so we do still have to cover young Earthers. And one of the problems with young Earth is the distant starlight problem. If you can go out and see the stars are billions of light years away. And the way the young Earthers handle this is they say that the speed of light is different in one direction than in another, that traveling away from the Earth, light travels at the speed of light. But when traveling to the Earth, light travels instantaneously. So that on day 4, when God made the sun, the moon, and the stars, all of the light from all of those stars came to the Earth and hit the Earth instantaneously. And I am curious, from a physics standpoint, what would that do?
From a physics standpoint, this is one of the arguments that comes out of young Earth creationists that drives me absolutely bonkers, because this light and the way light behaves is actually one of the most tested things in physics. And we can say with as close to certainty as we ever get in anything in science is that light behaves the same no matter what direction it's going or where it is in the universe. And we can actually test this out to distant reaches in the universe through, there's something in physics that I wouldn't expect anyone listening to know, but this might be the first time you've ever heard this term. There's another parameter in physics that is called the fine structure constant. And this fine structure constant, we can actually measure how it behaves out as far away as we can see in the universe. And the speed of light is part of this fine structure constant. And so we really have strong, overwhelming empirical evidence that the behavior of light does not change. So, there are many things about this argument from young Earth creationism that bother me, but one of them is that it seems to me to be a thinly veiled attempt to try to use science as a justification for their belief while not using science. And to me, that just is, it's sort of oxymoronic and it doesn't make sense. Now, That being said, I do want to be clear about one thing. If a young earth creationist wants to argue to me, and they have, and there's a well-known one with whom I have had this conversation, if they want to argue with me that there is a higher power, maybe it's the conventional God that they think of in young earth creationism, but if there's a higher power that created the universe exactly as it is, whether it's 10 seconds ago or 10,000 years ago, in order to look like the universe we have is billions of years old, that's an untestable statement, which means I can't prove it wrong. They
Mm-hmm.
could be right. I think it's highly unlikely, and we could talk about why it's highly unlikely, but I want to be clear that if a young earth creationist really wants to go all in and say that a God created the universe to fake us out and look like the universe is actually almost 14 billion years old, I can't prove that wrong. But what I can say is wrong is their overt misrepresentation of how light behaves in empirical inquiry and science. And so there's a real problem with them trying to use science in I think, an unethical way that's not scientific.
Okay, thank you. Now, when I was looking up some information for how to phrase that question, I ended up finding an article that really surprised me and I had not seen before. And it's not a talking point you hear often from young earthers. But one of the problems with the distant starlight, akin to the distant starlight problem, is the problem of plants existing before the sun and the stars exist.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I was looking up how they handle that, I ran into something that said that, okay, when on day 2 it talks about God separating the waters from the waters, I knew that the old way of looking at that was that the earth had a dome over it and there was water on the outside of the dome. And obviously even young earthers know that that is not the case, that we've sent people to the moon and there was no dome there.
Unless we're being faked out.
Right, unless they're being faked out. But what I saw was an article from Answers in Genesis that just simply moved the dome outward and said that the dome is surrounding the entire universe and that there's water on the outside of the universe on the outside of this dome. What are your thoughts on that take?
It's hard to know even where to begin unpacking how many things are wrong with this. I do have to applaud their creativity
Mm-hmm.
and their ability to move the goalpost whenever it suits their needs. um, but I do want to have a little bit of generosity and grace, in the sense that for people who don't have a deep understanding of science and how the universe has come to be the way it is, I really do have a lot of sympathy for looking for explanations that make sense within a given belief system, right? That is a
Mm-hmm.
normal human thing to do. And I don't mean to totally poke fun at them. The only people I really want to poke fun at are the ones who overtly and deliberately misrepresent things. I think that's fair game. When they are misrepresenting things they know to be false, I'm there to have that debate with them. So one of the things I really do have a lot of sympathy for is a basic question like, where did water come from? And this is, you may recall, this is a story I tell in my book about one of my children when they were very young, asking where water came from and having this discussion with them. And they were like 4 years old,
Mm-hmm.
and ended up, we went through the water cycle and we went back through, actually, just as a quick aside, the current scientific understanding is that most of the water on Earth came from things like comets or other icy bodies in the early solar system that crashed into us and they delivered the water. So just so y'all know, that's where we think it came from. But my daughter at the time, she was like, well, where did those comets come from? And then we worked back through these things called molecular clouds that are in outer space. And then we worked back through nucleosynthesis that happens in stars. And finally we got back to the creation of the universe itself. And she's like, well, where did that come from? And so I do want to say I have sympathy for people who are considering arguments about where things come from, because eventually we end up in what is called infinite regression. And
Mm-hmm.
it's not clear that there's there's a satisfying way out of that. Okay, so that aside, we can say pretty conclusively that the Earth is not surrounded by a shell of water. We know this for a variety of reasons, one of which is that water is very opaque to the universe. That's one of the
Mhm.
reasons why, if you've ever wondered why astronomers like to put observatories up on tops of mountains,
Mhm.
one of the reasons, actually, one of the observatories I use a lot is called the Atacama Large Millimeter Array. It's in the Atacama Desert in Chile at almost 20,000 feet.
Mm.
And that's to get it above the water vapor in the atmosphere because the water vapor is opaque to light. Okay, now, if the young Earth creationists want to say that there's a shell of water surrounding the universe, um, I would say two things. One, that's not empirically testable. So
Mhm.
I could say that there's a shell of M&Ms surrounding the universe too, and I would ask them to prove me wrong. But it also doesn't it doesn't fit with any of our understanding of the universe in terms of how heavy elements were created. And to have water, you need oxygen, right? It's H2O, and the O is oxygen. And to have oxygen, you have to have had stars that live and die and spew their guts around the universe, which include oxygen. And so there's just so much wrong with thinking that there's a shell of water around the universe, 14 billion light years away from us. It's hard to even know where to unpack this.
Mhm. In reading the book, you encourage the reader to use the imagination as to how the universe came to be, and I came up with my own personal favorite,
Ooh, I want
which
to know.
wasn't too far off from with one that you ended up presenting about a couple chapters later, which was that I think that there is a more intelligent life form on another universe, and they gave as an assignment creating a universe. And these were adolescents that they gave this assignment to. And the adolescents were strictly told not to create a universe that could sustain life because of the ethical problems. But one of the students created a universe that could sustain life, which is our universe. And because he knew he wasn't supposed to do that, he put the project in the back of a closet. And our universe is sitting in a closet inside of another universe.
I love that. It's such a great counterfactual sort of, not even necessarily counterfactual, but thought experiment in terms of,
Mhm.
speculative thinking. I love the idea, and I want to be clear, just because I love the idea doesn't make it right. It just
Right,
makes it
right.
enticing.
Mhm.
But I love the idea of thinking about our universe as, the equivalent of a homework assignment to some, or like a science project for some hyperdimensional, super intelligent extraterrestrial sort of being, which, for the record, also puts a new spin on what we consider to be a higher power,
Mhm,
right? Like,
mhm.
we could think of that as a god, depending on what we want to think of as a god or what qualities you might imbue to a god. And so I think, it's not out of the question. Again, I have to lean in as a scientist and say we can't empirically test it, but I'm with you. I think that explanation, or not exactly that explanation, but some version of it is not out of the question.
Okay. And
It's crazy, but it's not out of the question.
yeah, yeah. And one of the people that I really think about whenever I ask questions about young Earth is our current Speaker of the House. He is a young Earther. And that just blows my mind that we have people in government that are that misinformed. And as a result of that misinformation, we are seeing a serious issue, and that is defunding universities, defunding science, um, sending away our international students, threatening them with deportation. And I'm very concerned about what is happening to the scientific community. Can you speak to that?
Oh boy, how much time do we have? Um, we'll see how well this ages, right? Like, because this presumably will exist in the cloud into perpetuity. So, hopefully some of our predictions will not come true. Um, this is really an acute crisis, and I want to come at it from a couple directions. One is purely pragmatic, in the sense that I think what might concern most normal people about the attacks on science right now in the country would be things like it's going to inhibit our ability to advance healthcare. It's going to inhibit our ability to create those new discoveries. It's going to, and when we don't have those new discoveries, it inhibits our ability to advance economically. And I think all of those things are acutely true, right? We are sort of actively moving back into the dark ages right now. And I worry a lot about those. Myself and my colleagues are watching our grants and our abilities to do science completely cut off at the knees. And that is really deeply concerning in a pragmatic way. Now, that being said, I want to be clear. I am like all of my colleagues and hopefully many of your listeners really concerned about the pragmatic implications. And I am also deeply concerned about the philosophical implications in the sense that what is more worrying for me almost is one of my core beliefs, and I'm pretty forthright about this, is that I think a lot about the role of humans in the universe. And one of my core beliefs that has come out of that thinking is that one of the very most important things we can do with our time on Earth is learn and discover new things about the universe. And I would love to go on a tangent about why I think that's one of the most important things we can do with our time on Earth. But if one of the most important things we can do is learn, then when we are attacking learning and we are attacking science, we are, to my mind, actually attacking the very most important part of being human on the earth. And so this rapidly becomes like a philosophical argument for me that if we're not here to learn about ourselves and our place in the universe and the universe itself, then what the heck are we here for? So for me, it's almost an ethical position that I feel like is being attacked. There's also a quote that I would bet you and many of your listeners are familiar with from the late Carl Sagan, who was such a gifted promoter of science and science literacy. But one of his quotes I find to be really haunting and just utterly prescient, given that he gave this quote, I think it was in the early 90s. But one of the things he said was, I'm paraphrasing, so it's not exact, but one of the things he said is that we have created a society that is almost entirely dependent on science and technology, which I believe to be true, in which almost no one understands it. And that this is a recipe for disaster. And I think he was spot on, right? We do have a society that is almost entirely dependent on science and technology in every corner of our lives, from the way our food is produced to our medicine, to how our cars run, to the fuels we use. Try to think of an aspect of your life that isn't in some way dependent on science or technology, and it is hard. And when no one understands it, or almost no one, what we've done is we've disenfranchised the overwhelmingly vast majority of the population and ceded power with only a handful of people who do understand it or know how to manipulate it. And I think that is how we end up in dystopian situations. And so looping all the way back to your original question about this attack on science, I think it is deadly dangerous. And I really do wonder if I don't want to sound overly apocalyptic. I do try really hard to be an optimist, and I think at the core I really am an optimist. But when we attack learning and we attack science and we move back toward the dark ages, we are sending ourselves on a path to an apocalypse. And I really believe that to be true.
Bryce Bruchette says Carl Sagan called it a combustible mix of power and ignorance that will eventually blow up in our face.
Exactly, Bryce.
Okay, I have a question and a comment from Bryce that I've been holding for a bit. Bryce asks, doesn't the fine structure constant of which c, the speed of light, is part of, is also tied to the strength of the forces that hold atoms together, like the strong and weak nuclear forces?
Yes, exactly. Well done. You definitely did your homework. Yeah, so for people who are not familiar with the fine structure constant, which I infer is most most normal people, um, it is deeply involved in how atoms behave. And that's why when we look even in the far reaches of the universe, we can observe light that comes from atoms and the kind of light we get from atoms. And I don't want to go into a whole lecture on the kinds of light we get from atoms and why we get it, because at the end of the day, astronomers are really just scavengers of light. And so we've gotten really good at eking every bit of information out of light that we can. And when we look at light from atoms, even at, almost 13 billion light years ago in the universe, or light years away in the universe, we can see how the fine structure constant imprints itself on atoms and that hasn't changed. And so that's one of the big pieces of evidence that things like the speed of light have not changed over the evolution of the universe. So Bryce, you're quite right, and I appreciate you asking that question.
Okay, and then Bryce had a comment, which was in one of Stephen Baxter's Zeely sequence short stories, I believe, on the Orion line, the silver ghosts alter the speed of light in a large volume of space, speeds it up, and atomic bonds weaken.
I love that. Yeah, so I will say I have not read the Orion line, but now I'm going to write it down and put it on my list. So one of the things that's really interesting about the speed of light, and I think this is a common way to interpret it when one has had high school or perhaps college physics, is it is the speed at which light moves through space, right? I think that is how most normal people who have been exposed to it might define it. But it turns out that the speed of light is actually more fundamental than that. It's
Mm,
not just the speed at which photons move through space. It's the conversion factor really between space and time. And it just so happens that photons move at this speed because that is the fastest speed at which things can move through space. But the speed of light itself as a number isn't just limited to light, to photons. We call it the speed of light because that's where we first came upon it and discovered its properties. But it really is more fundamentally a conversion between the three dimensions of space and the dimension of time. And that gets into sort of much more deeper fundamental physics that I think most people aren't exposed to in high
mhm.
school or even introductory college level physics. And so that's one of the reasons why when I hear, the arguments from young earth creationists that have to do with the speed of light, they're really kind of betraying their ignorance of what the
Mm,
speed of light really represents.
mm, mm. This comment from Clement Green brings up a very funny story.
I love that.
In on New Year's Day in 2023, I spent it with my daughter and her kids in Virginia. And my daughter asked us each to go around
I
and
mean, everyone would want to spend it in Virginia, which is where I
that's right.
am, right? Yeah.
That's right. And my daughter asked us each to go around and say something that you learned in 2022. And when it was my turn, I said, I learned what redshift is. And I was about to explain, and my daughter went, no, wait. Is it child friendly?
Oh. Brilliant. I mean, I don't know, maybe talking about how the wavelength of light stretches out isn't child friendly, but not in the way your daughter was thinking.
No, not the way she was thinking. But Clement asked about orange shift. Is that a thing? Or
Um,
is Clement being funny?
um, I don't know if Clement is trying to be funny, but it is funny. And
Okay.
it is not a thing per se.
Okay.
And in fact, so this is where, sometimes astronomers just come up with stupid names for things. Apologies on behalf of all fellow astronomers in the history of astronomy. But um, so what happens with light is, as there are various ways that this can happen, but you think about life as light is really an electromagnetic wave. And what waves do is they go up and down in a sinusoidal fashion, right? They wiggle. And what happens with light under various conditions is that wiggling, which gives us a frequency and a wavelength, can either be stretched out, made longer, so it's a longer wavelength, or it can be compressed, so shortened, and it's a shorter wavelength. And longer wavelengths, so if we think about just optical light, the visible light that you and I see, when we spread out wavelengths, they become more red. And when we compress wavelengths, they become more blue. But that actually depends on where you're sitting in the spectrum, because if
Mm.
I'm looking at well, we can't even really see ultraviolet radiation because our eyes are not attuned to that. But if you were to like actually technically make ultraviolet radiation, this is where things get really confusing, more blue, that would be actually lengthening the wavelength because ultraviolet is bluer than blue. So anyway, all redshift really means at the end of the day is not necessarily making the light more red, unless it's optical light. But what it means is we're stretching that wavelength out and making the wavelength longer. And so in many cases, we can think about redshifting light. And if that light is already, say, in the infrared, so redder than red, and we stretch the wavelength out, we could make that wavelength in the microwave regime or in the radio regime. And so we've made that wavelength longer. So orange shift could have been a thing if we thought about shifting light, but it's just not a term we use.
Okay, very good, very good.
Getting a little technical, I'm sorry.
Oh no, not at all. I'm really happy to do it because this is where I get my science now. Is from people like you doing things like this.
Okay.
Um,
So I do hope that most people don't just get their science off of YouTube, because that way could be a little bit dangerous. But I'm happy to have this conversation.
One of the things you said in the book that that surprised me, only in that it had never occurred to me before, was you were talking about some of the experiments in abiogenesis.
Mm.
And you mentioned that we need to make sure that we have the ethics ahead of the science. And I thought, oh, it never even occurred to me that there was an ethical question about creating life.
Mm. Yeah, I feel like, sorry, I have a whole conversation going on in my head right now, which is why I'm pausing. I, I, I worry a lot that in modern society, and maybe this has been true in society since the dawn of humanity, I have no idea, but I worry a lot that we don't give enough thought to the ethical implications of what we do. For whatever reason, whether they just don't occur to us or we don't think that whatever it is we're acting upon is worthy of ethical consideration. It does give me pause, and it speaks to me in a way that suggests we have a lot of hubris, right? To think that we can do things and act upon the universe and create life without thinking about the ethical implications. And that really bothers me to the core, because I think really it comes down to the hubris of
Mhm.
thinking that we are somehow the masters of all and we have carte blanche to do whatever we want without thinking of anything else. And and at what point do things deserve to be considered and the impacts on them considered? And one could argue that there's a difference between, a rock that's sitting in my driveway and a living creature, and that may well be right. But I do think whenever we're doing anything that starts talking about life, I think we've got to pause and ask ourselves to think deeply about the ethics for sure. And one of the other things that I really believe to be true right now in the modern world is that in general, and this is across the board, our abilities, our technical abilities and our aspirations are proceeding so much faster than any of our ethical thinking. And there's there are billionaires pouring money into endeavors, because they want to make, I'll use air quotes, progress. Like, I don't know how we're going to define progress, and I think progress for progress sake to me is actually kind of a hollow imperative. But we've got to pause and ask ourselves what the ethical considerations are, because when our aspirations outpace our ethics, I think that's when we get ourselves into trouble as humans. And so when we talk about abiogenesis, so the potential ability to actually create life or something like life from, from scratch, from primordial things, we've got to pause and ask ourselves what we're doing.
And if we did create something, could this create a bio problem? I mean, is this new life form going to take over?
We humans tend to be pretty good at trying to kill things off that pose threats. Although, things like COVID and the flu notwithstanding, we haven't done a great job there. But, when we perceive threats, we do what we can to destroy them. And, for better or worse, that seems to be the case. But we also have to think about how we define lives ourselves. And most people, I think, I do this as an experiment when I'm teaching class, and I ask my students to sketch an extraterrestrial life form. And I would say, like, not even 9 times out of 10, like 99 times out of 100, my students will end up sketching something that basically resembles humans.
Humans. Yep.
Maybe it has 5 arms and a tail and 2 heads, and it has green skin, but it's still roughly humanoid, or at least not dissimilar from anything we might already see in our biosphere on Earth. And so I think we need to acknowledge that if we do either create life from scratch or find life elsewhere in the universe, it may really have no resemblance at all to anything on Earth we currently consider to be alive. So if we were to create life from scratch with abiogenesis, who knows what forms it might take? Maybe it would be roughly bacterial, or even something that looks like a virus. And according to modern biology, viruses are not generally considered to be alive, but they do have some characteristics of what it means to be alive. What form is that life going to take? We have no idea.
Another area where this comes up is AI. We're not all that far from AI becoming a life form.
Yeah. I don't disagree with you. And this is where I think we have to really think. I mean, the number of speculative fiction novels and movies that have been written about AI being alive, I think I don't even know if we could count them at this point. But I do, again, this is where I think our ethical thinking needs to catch up to our abilities and our aspirations, and really ask ourselves what it means for something to be alive. At the end of the day, I'm actually fairly convinced that we may need to move away from what I consider to be a false dichotomy of things either being alive or not being alive. I think that is far too simplistic. And I think what we may need to eventually do is have a continuum of aliveness, right? And maybe it's actually a multidimensional version of aliveness. And of course, I'm sure we as humans would probably define ourselves as the most alive something could be. I would argue that that's probably hubris, and we should leave room for things to be more alive than we are. I don't know what that would mean. But, where AI might fall on the aliveness scale might not be totally not alive. So we need to be open to that.
Okay, a couple of comments that have come in of interest. This is a joke, but it was quite funny. I always thought redshifting was moving towards live and learn.
Fair.
And then DeVos asked, will you ask her to expand on why she thinks it's important to study and explore the universe?
Okay.
I'm sure you'll love that question.
Why do I think it's important? This for me is really actually what makes me tick. And so I have a love-hate relationship with this question, and I want to be clear on that, because I have a hard time answering it, in the sense that for me, what I feel as sort of an actual internal drive to study and understand the universe is kind of like breathing. In the sense that when people ask me why I went into astrophysics, like, what I really want to say is, well, why didn't you? Because it's kind of like choosing not to breathe. Like, why would you not breathe? Like, and so I like flipping that question, and how could one not think it's important to study the universe that we live in. But I also realize that that question might be a little bit too flippant for some people. So when I really think about why, for me, exploring and understanding the universe is important, it comes down to what I think is probably truly one of the greatest existential questions that humans have been wrestling with as long as there have been humans. And that is, what is our place in the universe, and what does it mean to be human in the universe? And I don't know of any other way to really get at that question other than trying to understand the universe. But more than that, one of the things I'm super mindful of is that, as far as we know, and this could change any day, but as far as we know right now, we humans are the only sentient beings in the universe that are capable of trying to understand the universe. Now, that could change, and it will be really cool if it changes, but as of our understanding right now, we are it. Now, in addition to that, we are actually, we know what we're made of. We know where these elements that created our body and our blood and our bones came from. And in some ways, our physical bodies are literally sentient fluctuations of the universe itself, right? We are made of the universe itself. So when I put these two things together, what that tells me is that we are the universe itself made self-aware, and we may be, again, this could change, but as of right now, we are the only parts of the universe that are the universe self-aware. And so for me, that turns into an ethical, like truly an ethical imperative to try to understand this universe that we are made of and that we are a part of. And I can't envision ever wanting to bury my head in the sand and just kind of go la 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 la, like we're just here along for the ride, because I feel like our existence is so much richer than that if we try to understand where we came from and what we're a part of.
Okay, very good. I think Enjoy the Show summed it up with to understand ourselves and the world we live in.
Yeah, that's
Mhm.
right.
Mhm.
And I do think that's true, that by trying to understand the universe, we're literally understanding ourselves.
Mhm. Mhm.
Maybe some people don't want to understand themselves, and you do you, but I feel like the ethic of know thyself is actually fairly important.
Yes, I would agree with you there. One chapter of the book was on dark matter and dark energy. And this was an entirely new concept to me that there was such a thing as dark energy. Can you explain a little bit, as you do in the book, about what is the difference between dark matter and dark energy?
Yeah, of course. Okay, so the first thing I have to, I think, admit to anyone who's listening is that this word dark is really code among astronomers for we don't know what it is.
Ah,
And so what it means is that we see empirical evidence that things are happening, but we can't see what's causing them. And we don't know what it is, and we have to call it something, and so we just call it dark. Now, I'm being a little bit flippant, but in the case of dark matter, now we've known about the existence of dark matter for actually many decades longer than we've known about the existence of dark energy. And in the case of dark matter, there really was a real reason for calling it dark, and that is that what we see when we observe things in the universe is evidence for large amounts of mass. And we see this through its gravitational impact, right? Because mass has gravity, and then gravity causes things to move and behave in certain ways. So we see evidence for really incredible amounts of mass out in the universe that we can't see. And it's not just that we can't see it. It's not just that it's dark. It's that it doesn't appear to interact with light in any way. It doesn't emit light, that doesn't absorb light. And so it makes it very, very hard to test what this thing called dark matter could be. So, so it is called dark because we can't see it and it doesn't appear to interact with light. Um, and astronomers have, over the intervening decades, and now it's been several decades, been systematically ruling out things that it could be, starting with really the most obvious things. So it's often funny for me when I happen to be, let's say at a cocktail party and chatting with someone, and dark matter comes up, as it does at any good cocktail party. And um, I'll be saying, well, there's something that has a lot of gravity associated with it that we can't see. And, this poor well-meaning person will be like, they're going through the Rolodex of things in their brain. And kudos to them, right, for being like, oh, what could it be that we can't see that has mass? And like, oh, have you thought about black holes?
Mhm.
And I'll say, like, oh, you're right. Astronomers have been thinking about this for decades, and no one ever thought about black holes. And so there's some sort of like almost level of mansplaining that comes in there sometimes that drives me a little bit crazy. But again, good for them thinking about solutions. Yes, we've ruled out most kinds of black holes. There's one primordial type of black hole that has not totally been ruled out yet. But in any case, there's something in the universe that has a whole lot of mass and comes with a whole lot of gravity, and we don't know what it is, and we call it dark matter. Dark energy is totally different. The only thing it has in common with dark matter is the word dark. And again, dark here is code for we don't know what it is and we can't see it. And we didn't even discover dark energy until it was like maybe the 1990s. And
well, that explains why I'd never heard of it.
you can forgive yourself for not having heard of it. It actually turns out, as we're recording this now, there was a big news release on dark energy just a couple of weeks ago, and there's some new information coming in that's shifting things around in some interesting ways. But the gist of dark energy is the following, and that is that we know the universe is expanding. We've known that since Edwin Hubble was around, right? So we've known that for a very, very long time. Now, it turns out that, okay, we know the universe is expanding, but how fast it's expanding and whether that expansion is slowing down or staying the same has implications for the fate of the universe. So there's nothing less than the fate of the universe at stake here. So when something as big as that is at stake, you end up having teams of incredibly brilliant people going out trying to figure out what the situation is, because there's a Nobel Prize at stake here, right? Like, for sure, if someone can figure out what the fate of the universe is, like, they're going to get their name in history. And as much as I love my fellow scientists, we do have a bit of vanity sometimes, and we do like our names to be in history. So be that as it may, these two teams of really brilliant researchers went out to find out how fast the universe was slowing down, right? The idea was that, yeah, the universe is expanding, but the universe is made of stuff, and this stuff has mass, and that mass has gravity. And so that expansion ought to be slowing down because the gravity is sort of causing it to slow down. So these brilliant teams go out to find out how fast the universe is slowing down so that they could determine the fate of the universe. And it's good that there were two teams using different telescopes and different techniques and different software, because they started to get their results back. And at first they were like, this doesn't make sense. Something's wrong, right? We need to check all of the systematics and how we're doing this and all of our experimental setup, because what they started seeing signs of was that the universe isn't slowing down. In fact, the expansion of the universe is accelerating. It's speeding up. And you can't do that without an injection of energy. And so this was a paradigm shift in astrophysics, and it was heavily debated for many years, with everyone throwing the kitchen sink at this, trying to figure out what was wrong, because the universe can't possibly be accelerating. So something is wrong with the observations, something is wrong with the assumptions, something is wrong with the setups, and all that we managed to do was prove it more strongly and more strongly and more strongly that the universe is in fact the expansion is accelerating. We don't know what is causing that acceleration. We know it's an injection of energy from somewhere, and so we call it dark. And that is where we come up with dark energy. There are a couple hypotheses on the table for what might be causing it, but we don't know the answer yet, which is kind of exciting.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. My life has always centered around religion. It was the central point of my life for 42 years.
Mm.
And then after 42 years in religion, I suddenly discovered that almost everything I knew was wrong. And so 6 years ago, I began a new journey of trying to right all of the wrong things that I'd been taught.
Mm,
And I now endeavor to speak about atheism primarily as a backlash against just so much wrong information that I was fed for so long.
mhm,
And so, as a result, I do get into a lot of talks with Christians. And the first thing that always comes up is, if there is no God, then where did the universe come from?
mhm,
And one of the atheist talking points that we get to on that is that we don't know where the universe came from, but one of the things we don't know is whether or not the universe could have been any different. Could the laws of nature have been different?
mhm.
Speak to that a little bit.
Oh, I love this topic so much, as you will know, because I have chapters on both where the universe came from and what the laws of nature are in my book, which you were so generous to share. Um, so we have, let me just set the stage here, right? So we have what what we believe are laws of nature, which manifest themselves in forces. And as of today, we know of four known forces. We have gravity, electromagnetism, the weak force, and the strong force. But we hypothesize that much earlier in the universe, those four forces were actually combined into a single force. Now, aside from those four forces, we have, I don't know if any of you have ever had the pleasure of opening a physics textbook. But if you open, I mean, people don't even probably have physics textbooks anymore. I think they just use it online. But back in the day, at least when I was in school, I had a physics textbook and it weighed like 30 pounds.
Mm-hmm.
And you open the chapter, always either on the front chapter or the back chapter, there would be a couple pages of just numbers, right, that are there, I think, to help you when you're solving homework problems and you don't have to go look something up. So things like the speed of light, right? So all of these numbers that you need to solve things in physics. And I suspect, as was the case for me when I was a student, you just kind of take these numbers as given, and someone somewhere measured these numbers and that was that. And you didn't really, well, I didn't really think any more deeply about it. It turns out that we think, as of today, and this could be wrong, that roughly 20 or so of these numbers that help to characterize the universe are independent. And not only are they independent, but we don't know why they have the values that they have. And so when it comes to physics, right, and to science, we really like to have an answer to why. Like, why is the speed of light the value that it is? And we actually don't know. And so for roughly 20 of these constants, we don't know why they have the values that they do. And more than that, and this is where I think the rubber really hits the road when we start to talk about different belief systems and where the universe came from. It turns out that if you took any one of these 20 or so parameters that help to define the universe and you tweaked it, even just a little bit in some cases, the universe that would result from that, like you have a toy universe, and let's say we made gravity a little bit stronger, the toy universe that unfolds is radically different, and in most cases, in almost all cases, actually appears to be inhospitable to life as we know it.
Mm-hmm.
So this is called the fine tuning problem, and the question is whether or not the universe is fine tuned. And if it is fine tuned, does that suggest that there had to be a higher power that did the fine tuning? There are a number of different ways one might explain fine tuning. And yes, one of them is a higher power. Maybe a higher power did it. Or even as we were talking about earlier in the show, it could have been, a extra dimensional, super intelligent, higher power homework assignment, right? Where they
Mm-hmm.
were like, here are 20 parameters and go tune them and find the set that creates life. Like you could imagine sort of a speculative fiction version of a universe like that. We can't rule it out, right? That is one of the explanations on the table. But there are other explanations too. And that's where I think it is really important for us to always have intellectual humility and and acknowledge that just because we don't understand something doesn't mean it's not understandable. And so, for example, one of the things that might have caused the values of these various parameters of the universe to have the values that they do could have to do with a theory called, well, I want to say it's a hypothesis. Scientifically, it's not really a theory, but it's called string theory. Some people have probably heard of it. And in string theory, one of the things we think about is that there are these multi-dimensional topographical shapes, these constructs that exist that actually give our universe extra dimensions. But the shape of these, they're commonly, there's a word here, they're called Calabi-Yau manifolds, which is a big mouthful. But the exact shape of these hyperdimensional constructs would give rise to the values that things have in our universe. We don't know if this is right, but if it is, it then gives us a why. A reason why things have the values that they do, or rather how they have the values that they do. It still doesn't tell us where those Calabi-Yau manifolds came from, and whether they could have been otherwise. So we end up always back in the state of infinite regression. And I think it's important always, always, always. There are two things that really matter to me in conversations like this. One is curiosity. And I really want to always invite people into a space of existential curiosity, because I think curiosity opens doors and opens your brain, and intellectual humility. And knowing that even though we humans appear to be the apex of intellectual ability on the planet Earth, that does not mean that we are capable of understanding everything that is understandable. And we need to acknowledge that, right? Our DNA is only 1.2% different than chimpanzees. And yet, I'm pretty sure that we couldn't teach chimpanzees calculus or quantum mechanics or thermodynamics or general relativity. And so by extrapolation, what if we were another 1.2% further intellectually advanced? What might we be able to understand then? In the equivalent of what chimpanzees could understand now. So we've got to invoke intellectual humility here instead of always jumping to a conclusion that just because we don't understand something, it has to be a higher power.
Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely. Yeah, that also made me think of something else that's a little bit funny is the book that my younger daughter gave my older daughter when her fourth child was born is a book called Calculus for Infants.
Oh, jeez.
Are you
They're
familiar
getting
with the
younger
book?
and younger. I am not, and I'm a little bit horrified, but also good on them.
Yeah, it actually is an excellent book. It's about a parabola, and I forget what the other shapes are. And it's a story of friendship, and it's your basic story that you would expect for very young children, but the math terms are in the story, so that when the child gets used to the story, they're used to hearing the math terms.
I love that, right? I think people are almost taught to be afraid of things like calculus, right?
Hmm.
And so by the time you're in calculus, you're already predisposed to being afraid of it. But what if in earlier and younger ages, we taught things in a warmer, friendlier, more intuitive way so that people could understand it better? I think that's great.
Okay, we have a question from Jesus Tales who asked, is academia biased against religious ideas in science discussions? And I know exactly where he's coming from with this question, because one thing that we see frequently from creationists is the claim that, well, people who are putting out academic papers who are not creationists are just biased, and they have to say the things that they say.
This is a great question, and I really do appreciate it. And one thing I think I want to be clear on is that I think every human is biased in their own way. And the
Hmm.
best we can do is try to push back against our own biases and be aware of them. I think I've actually come to really think that confirmation bias in general, or also known as assimilation bias, is at the root of almost all of the problems in humanity. Maybe not all of them, but a lot of them, because we as humans are psychologically wired to confirm things, try to seek confirmation for things that we want to be true. So I would be lying if I said that there weren't biases that exist in academia. Of course there are, because academics are human. But that being said, one of the things that we try very, very hard to do, which isn't to say we always succeed, but we try very, very hard to be aware of our own biases and check them, and to check them against each other. And in particular, in science, a scientist, I don't know any scientists who get out of bed in the morning and are like, you know what I want to do today? I want to reproduce an experiment that someone else did and get the same answer. That sounds like fun, right? That's just not how scientists work. Like, what makes things fun for us is to this sounds really mean, but we do it in kind of a friendly way, but it's to break other people's theories and
Mhm.
find new ways of thinking about things, and find things that are wrong with existing ways of thinking about things. And so we're always actively pushing back on and trying to check our biases. Again, that's not to say that it's perfect, because it absolutely is not perfect. But I think that there are also, I think we also have to be mindful of what is and is not within the realm of empirical inquiry, right? Empirical inquiry has its limits. And there are things that can be true about the universe that are not subject to science, to empirical inquiry. And again, this comes back to being, some intellectual humility, is being forthright about things that we can and can't say, and the epistemology, right? The study of knowledge that and the assumptions of knowledge that brought us to the ability to think we can say what we think we can say. But I do know a number of people across academics and in astrophysics who hold a whole range of different religious perspectives, because there are beliefs that sit outside of our ability to test them. And if we can't test them, we can't prove them right or wrong, and that means they could very well be right. I have my own set of, I would say, I don't know that I would call them religious beliefs. I think I would call them spiritual beliefs, that are not testable. And
Mhm.
I keep them actually very close to my chest, because I think when I am teaching, especially, when I'm in a classroom, especially with 18 to 22-year-olds, um, I see it as essential that my foremost priority is to help them learn to think for themselves. And I think that means, as the supposed authority in the classroom, I do not tell them what I think. Right. I think it's most important for them to come to conclusions on their own. So such a long-winded answer, because I think this is a really important question that I think all of us need to think about, are what biases we bring with us and how we can check them. And I would also argue, and this actually gets to what you said, you said you were 42 when you came to think almost everything you learned was wrong. I think our willingness to be wrong is incredibly important. If there is something about which you are not willing to be wrong, that tells you right away that you have deeply baked in confirmation bias. And so I wish that we could sort of change the way we look at things and be like, being wrong is actually pretty awesome. And being willing to admit when we're wrong. That's how we make progress and how we grow as humans.
Mhm. Mhm. One final question I'd like to ask you, and that is, what is your own personal favored view of how the universe came to be?
Oh. Oh, this question, just an easy one in the last couple minutes. Um, okay, so I do not know the answer to
Right,
where the
right.
universe came from. I want to be super, super clear on that. And in the chapter on this in my book, I go through a number of different scenarios that could be where the universe came from. But the one that I want to be true, so again, I have to check my confirmation bias here, because I know I want this to be true, just because for me, as like a mother of three, I love this. But the one I most want to be true is that our universe actually was created with and from the creation of a black hole in a parent universe, in like a mother universe. And it could be, and this is one of the hypotheses on the table, that when black holes are created, they could actually create entire universes within them. And there are a lot of subtleties and nuances here about whether it might work that we don't have time to go into right now. But our universe, as you know, I'm looking around my house and at the things in my house right now. Our universe as it is consistent with being inside of a black hole that was created in a parent universe. And in fact, what we commonly refer to as the Big Bang is consistent with the opposite of a black hole, a white hole. And so there are a lot of reasons to think that it's not crazy to think we're living inside of a black hole that was created in a parent universe. Now, that just kicks the can down the road because hopefully people are now asking, well, where did that universe, that mother universe come from? And that takes us down this route of infinite regression. But it is an explanation that I really like, and I want it to be true, and I kind of hope it is.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Johnson. It's been a pleasure having you on. Dr. Johnson's book is Into the Unknown, The Quest to Understand the Mysteries of the Cosmos. And there is a link in the description to the Amazon copy of the book, so you can order a copy for yourself. We have just scratched the surface of the book, trust me. There is so much more in it, and it is well worth reading.
So much fun. Thank you for having me today.
Next week, there will be no stream. I'm going to be out of town. And the following week, my guest is going to be the rabid atheist. So see you then. And thank you again, Dr. Johnson. And thank you, everyone in the chat, for your comments and questions. Live your life.